We've got a question here from Jordan Jones. This is really the other side of the equation. Question is, do you have any tips for swaying a client away from 100% test coverage? So if a client comes in, and many clients come in saying, we don't want tests, just write the code. And you're like, oh, no, no, no. But some will come in saying, we want 100% test coverage. Do you have any tips for saying, listen, it's just not worth it? Swaying them away from that if possible.
I generally use the story about the thing where somebody was like hitting a useless thing just to have their coverage up. But I think, one thing that's really helpful in Xcode is that you can show code coverage, and you can show that a file that's not 100% covered actually, the pieces that aren't covered are not necessarily pieces that need to be covered. These are emergency guard bailouts. These are things where you can sort of see, hey, if something's gotten to this phase, things are really messed up. And so you would need to just bail out of it. But you don't necessarily need to test that has happened, because writing that test takes away time from are we doing more tests on the mission critical part of the application. I think another thing I tell people is 100% test coverage doesn't mean it's never going to not work. It doesn't mean it's never going to not crash. You can have tested every single line of code in your application, but if somebody puts some weird input in there that you weren't really prepared for, there's a significant possibility that it might not work. The other thing is, if you test everything once rather than testing some of those mission critical things repeatedly, you have this sort of false sense of assurance that, oh yeah, I've tested everything. Whereas if you really make sure that you've thoroughly tested a lot of the possibilities of how things could go wrong on your mission critical code, that may not necessarily add up to 100% test coverage, but you are way less likely to have problems.
Right, and it's like that old QA joke, a QA engineer walks into a bar, orders a 1 beer, orders 9.99 in beers, orders -1 beer, orders a lizard kind of thing, throwing garbage input, really hard fuzz testing. And the other thing I think is that ultimately it's a number, and it's not even a good number, because all it means is while this test was run, these lines of code were run. They could have been completely unrelated to what you're trying to test, or not even evaluated even slightly. They were just run as part of the test that was being run. So that doesn't mean anything. It doesn't prove your code works in any meaningful way whatsoever. It makes me so angry sometimes that people take this number so seriously, when really it's just a number, a nice number, but still a number.
Yeah, and I think I think there's definitely, one thing to remember also with Swift is there's a bunch of stuff where the type system handles a bunch of the things that would be requiring more test coverage in other languages. So in Python, you might have to test hey, is this thing that I'm getting back actually a string? And in Swift, if it's not a string, it doesn't compile. So it's definitely something where that having that context is helpful, particularly for non-technical people, where it's just understanding that okay, in a Python backend, you might have to test is this a string? But in a Swift backend, you don't have to do that, because the compiler does that for you at compile time, and it won't do anything at all if it's not doing what it needs to do. So I think those are some strategies I would use around that. Honestly, usually the people that I have to convince are usually not the clients, but usually the managers, because managers love the statistic of 100% test coverage. They think it looks amazing.
Yeah.
And I think it is something where there's plenty of places where they sort of pick an arbitrary number for test coverage and they try to hit it. And I think that having a number is a lot less important than actually taking the time to go through your code every once in a while and look at what isn't tested. Because, some of it's stuff where, hey, maybe you might actually be able to delete it. Some of it's stuff where, okay, yeah, that makes sense to not test. Some of it's oh, I should probably test that. But it's something where if you're able to do that regularly, that's going to be much more effective than constantly trying to hit an arbitrary goal of a certain percentage of test coverage. In practice, I've generally found somewhere between 75 and 85% is the best in terms of balancing what do I need to test realistically versus what do I need to sort of move on with my life from.
Yes.
And, but like that's a very, very wide range. And I think it's something where, that's also inclusive of an application that has UI. There's certain things with UI that are going to be harder to test, especially stuff like animations and drag and drop and stuff like that. Like some of that is a real pain to test. And, I think it's much easier to have even higher test coverage on an SDK that has no UI involvement. But it's also something where there's not a number that I think is something that people should shoot for all the time. And I think that if people are looking for a number, ask them why they're looking for that number. What is the assurance that they're trying to get from saying that they have 100% test coverage? Is it that it's never going to crash? 100% test coverage doesn't guarantee that. Is it that it's always going to work? 100% test coverage does not guarantee that. And so that's something where finding out the underlying reason why people want something is usually much more helpful.